Started recording so that we can get this program online for those that can't attend live. My name is Sheena Gregg. I am a registered dietitian with the Department of Health Promotion and Wellness, and as part of Body Appreciation Week, which is our campus's celebration of Eating Disorders Awareness Week that will be occurring nationally next week, we are so excited to present an orthorexia based topic for this week with our partners from the Renfrew Center. I did want to make a couple housekeeping announcements before I introduce our speaker. So, if you are attending today for a Greek point, towards the end of today's presentation, I will be sharing a QR code so that you can officially check in. I'll also put that check-in link within the chat so that you can access it that way as well. Also, too, if you need to leave the program a little bit early before that QR code is posted, just send me an email. I'm actually going to put the best email address for me in the chat so that you have that, and then we can kind of double check the length of time that you are available for the program, and we can get that check-in information sent to you. So without further ado, our speaker today is Lacey Vogel, LMHC. She is a clinical training specialist at the Renfrew Center. She joined the Renfrew Center of Boston in 2017 as a primary therapist and was promoted to team leader in a team leader role in 2019 before stepping into the role of clinical training specialist at the end of 2022. She received her bachelor's degree in philosophy, neuroscience, and psychology from Washington University in St. Louis and her master's degree in mental health counseling and behavioral medicine from Boston University School of Medicine. She has extensive experience treating athletes with eating disorders and has a special interest in working with patients with trauma histories. Prior to joining Renfrew, she worked at an adolescent day treatment program for those diagnosed with major mental illness. She also has a background working with all genders and ages with eating disorders at the residential, partial hospitalization, and intensive outpatient levels of care. So if you didn't know already, we have a fantastic speaker with such a breadth of experience. And now I am going to turn things over to Lacey. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And I'm sorry, my computer logged me off for a moment. So I'm sorry that my screen went away. Thank you so much for the introduction. So yes, I am a therapist by background. I'm really passionate about the eating disorder space. In fact, my curiosity with eating disorders really started in college. So I always love speaking at college campuses. I had a lot of friends who struggled in college. It was really rampant where I went to school, and I think I've heard that from a lot of people. I'm excited to kind of bring some awareness to the topic for orthorexia today. I guess I should try and go back to my other slide, but so yes, we're going to be talking about orthorexia and a world of wellness fads. And just to really briefly, even though I'm not in a Renfrew clinical role anymore, meaning I'm not a therapist at Renfrew anymore, I still do have an outpatient practice where I treat a lot of folks who do struggle with eating disorders, the whole let's say spectrum of eating disorders, including orthorexia, which you will learn today is actually technically not a diagnosed eating disorder, but it's pretty close. So today we're going to talk about the symptoms and just a really brief history of what even is orthorexia. And it also is sometimes known as orthorexia nervosa. I'll typically just use the shortened term orthorexia. We'll talk about some warning signs and then the spectrum between what's an eating disorder versus what's orthorexia versus like what's a wellness diet. Certainly going to bring in some of just like the sociocultural climate that's happening in our world right now, because you cannot certainly not dissociate the two, meaning that the world we live in definitely has a tendency to highlight and idealize those orthorexic tendencies. And then assess some cultural considerations throughout. So trying to get a lot done in the brief time we have together. So orthorexia, you might have heard of it, but I want to give you some background as to what it is. And I thought I knew what it was until I really started doing a bit more research on it. So I think this will hopefully be a good comprehensive overview. So really what orthorexia is, it's an obsessive preoccupation with healthy nutrition. Typically what this looks like is an individual will follow a very rigid, typically restrictive health, quote unquote, healthy diet. So usually this involves avoiding foods that the person indicates to themselves like are not unhealthy, sorry, are unhealthy and impure. So things that have like additives or certain ingredients added to them, or GMOs or organic, things like that, where this person might stay away from it. And a violation in that really rigid way of eating ends up leading to extreme emotional distress. Usually we see a lot of guilt and anxiety. Similar to other eating disorders, which I'm not going to go over the whole spectrum of eating disorders in this particular presentation, but similar to other eating disorders, orthorexia does often lead to impairments in quality of life, and also potentially like medical complications or physical impairments. What we do know about orthorexia is that there is a pretty significant clinical overlap with anorexia nervosa and OCD. There are often times if someone's coming to a treatment center or to seek therapy and they need a diagnosis, let's say for insurance purposes, typically they'd probably fall into one of those categories. However, orthorexia is not an official eating disorder diagnosis. And what that means is that there's not really much research, nor is there actually any official diagnostic criteria for orthorexia. My hope is that someday it will be defined as a clinical eating disorder, because I think at that point we'll start to see more research and more treatment modalities that be more effective for this particular condition. But right now it is not characterized as such in the mental health disorder diagnostic manual. I think the history of orthorexia is just very interesting. So I just wanted to include a slide on it because, like, where did it come from in the first place? So it was coined in 1997 by a doctor named Stephen Bratman. He was a health enthusiast himself and actually found himself being pretty rigid with his own eating patterns. He was also working with clients who were classified as pretty extreme dieters, and because of their extreme diets, they were developing health problems. The in Greek, orthorexia means correct righteous appetite. So that's just an interesting note. It wasn't until 5 or 6, no, my math's wrong there, 8 years later, that the earliest article in PubMed even appeared using the term orthorexia. And then in 2014, about a decade ago, this term was further popularized, especially in like the social media space, by Jordan Younger. She went by on her Instagram handle, the Blonde Vegan. She's now known as the Balance Blonde. And she wrote this book in 2015 called Breaking Vegan. It's one woman's journey from veganism, extreme dieting, and orthorexia to a more balanced life. So at the time in 2014, she outright admitted to her friends and to people in her life that she had an eating disorder that was based more on the quality of eating and not the quantity. At the time, she admitted she was drinking only green juices all day long for many weeks at a time. And she told 60 Minutes Australia, I looked healthy. Everyone told me I was a beacon of health. So that's why some of these behaviors can really kind of go under the radar, because we kind of in this culture assume that that's actually like really great. As if you're being really, really, really healthy with your eating, you must have great willpower. You must be the beacon of health. And she quickly learned that from this particular way of eating, she was really limiting her life and also started to have physical and medical complications occur as well. So clean eating is something that comes up a lot in the orthorexia space, and clean eating is defined in many different ways. Um, it is really, by the definition I'm using today in this presentation, this idea of like hyper focusing on, again, the quality of food. So that means like choosing foods that don't have additives, maybe they're not processed or genetically modified. And someone who follows a clean eating diet really won't eat foods that have unnatural ingredients. So this might mean eliminating foods with trans fats, animal products, dyes, sugars, dairy. It is important to note that the idea of clean eating is more of a concept as I'm talking about it in our American society, but this idea does vary by country and by area of the world. So really, there's not an agreed upon definition, especially because there's this kind of like moral component involved in clean eating, right? you're good, you're having a good day, you're having a good week if you're eating clean and healthy. But it's a bad week if you have those cheat days, for example. So it's not that I'm saying, eating, focusing on the quality of your food is bad. It's just when it comes to that really extreme, I need to do this or else I feel dysregulated emotionally or else I have a terrible day, that's when we start to see some really significant problems, especially if people can't be flexible or spontaneous in their eating habits. So the self-test that Stephen Bratman came out with to kind of identify, right, maybe do you struggle with some orthorexic tendencies? So these are the questions he has on that test. Do you spend more than 3 hours a day thinking about your diet? Do you plan your meals several days ahead? Is the nutritional value of your meal more important than the pleasure of eating it? Has the quality of your life decreased as the quality of your diet has increased? Have you become stricter with yourself lately? Does your self-esteem get a boost from eating healthy? Have you given up foods you used to enjoy in order to eat the quote unquote right foods? Does your diet make it difficult for you to eat out, distancing you from friends and family? Do you feel guilty when you stray from your diet? And do you feel at peace with yourself and in total control when you eat healthily? Now, if my memory serves, I didn't write it down on the slide, but I'm pretty sure if you score a 7 out of 10, there's a pretty strong indication that orthorexia could be something that you're struggling with. So just going to keep this in mind when we're thinking about what kind of questions we would ask someone who might be struggling or ask ourselves. So statistics are quite difficult to find. I found a few in the research, but again, because there's not a whole lot of research out there on orthorexia, I imagine these aren't extremely accurate. But essentially 28% of folks with anorexia or bulimia also have comorbid orthorexia. So also have this in addition to that eating disorder diagnosis. We've seen that orthorexia rates actually rise to 53% after completing eating disorder treatment. So this is for someone who might be considering themselves in recovery, that actually maybe they go to the place of struggling with orthorexia, which I'll talk about a little bit later. And statistically, it says it affects about 1% of the general population, which is less than the general population being affected by diagnosable eating disorders like anorexia and bulimia. However, I do think the statistic is actually way higher, just based on what I've seen, what I've heard, both in my personal life and with my clients. It is important to be aware of the medical and psychological risks because, again, like we can look at someone and think, oh, they're the beacon of health if they're eating clean and healthy all the time, but there might be some things happening internally that we're not seeing. This person might be experiencing more stress, irritation, guilt. Again, there might be some functioning impairments in their life. We see a lot of self-esteem being intertwined with food choices that might increase depression and anxiety for that person. Nutritional deficiencies can certainly impact health. So that could be your cardiovascular health, your GI system, neurological health, your endocrine system, or for folks who menstruate, amenorrhea is common. And also a difficulty with emotion regulation, which as a therapist, that's the one I'm typically focused on. The thing that's really interesting, the self-esteem piece especially, is I've had clients who really do feel like they have to be on a very rigid, clean eating schedule Monday through Friday, right? And then on the weekends, I can break it. But like Monday through Friday, I have to be really good. And if they go out of their way and break that rigid eating from Monday through Friday, their whole weekend is ruined. I've had clients who then really struggle when, let's say, it's midweek and their boss wants to have a meeting with them that's over dinner. Well, then what do? I had this really specific idea of what I was going to eat for dinner. And now here my boss is asking me to go off that plan. And that's really hard. What we want to be mindful of in terms of like warning signs for orthorexia is someone socially isolating more, right? They're struggling to eat with others. Is there an increase in preoccupation with food, generally speaking? Are they talking more about food, thinking more about food, dreaming about food at all hours of the day? Typically, we see some hyper-perfectionistic tendencies. And usually this person may not eat anything outside of the home or not anything that's prepared by someone else because they don't know what ingredients were used or how much of the ingredients were used. Typically, there's an element of inflexibility with routine, so spontaneity is very challenging. And a person can become more invested in eating routines, including doing research on diet and wellness fads. And it's not so hard to find research, quote unquote, research out there that today. You can go on social media and I'll talk about this a little bit later in the presentation, but you'll be fed all the wellness fads and diets you need to know about. Lots of time shopping for food. So this is very time intensive for folks. Again, a large part of the day spent thinking about food. We see that increase in irritability, depression, anxiety. The person might not be able to stop, right? They've started and now they're really stuck and unable to stop this extreme diet. And sometimes we do see rigid exercise routines. Someone who has orthorexic tendencies or orthorexia might not have strict exercise routines. However, in the population I've worked with and the clients I've seen, 9 times out of 10, I also see rigid gym rituals or workout rituals, and also a struggle to with self-esteem or with irritability or mood if they miss a workout. So why does orthorexia develop? And we can think about that with any eating disorder. Why does any one person develop an eating disorder? And of course, there's usually not just one reason why. But with orthorexia specifically, sometimes folks have a health scare, or someone in their family has some sort of illness, let's say cancer. And so there's a really big fear, like, well, what if I get this? What if it's genetic to me? What if it runs in the family? Or what if I myself experience something really scary? We hear a lot about like certain foods causing inflammation and all this kind of stuff that's out there. People might have a strong reaction and want to totally change their whole diet. Now, sometimes it is important to switch up your diet, and I am not a dietitian, so I'm not going to speak to that. But I'm talking more in those extreme cases where either there's not really much information that would indicate you need to change much in your diet, and or someone goes to the extreme end of totally changing every single thing that they're eating, typically outside the purview of a doctor. Another reason why someone might go to food, to controlling their food intake and what they're eating, is a need for control during chaotic time. I'm thinking about college can be chaotic time. I think that's why when I was a student in college, I remember wondering if some of my friends were struggling because it was like their first time away from home. Some of those relational dynamics can get really heightened, right? You're living with, eating with, all the things with your classmates and your friends. It can be wonderful and also really stressful. Sometimes people do this to create a unique identity. Sometimes there's a desire to actually decrease socialization, right? If I can't eat anything anyone else around me is eating, well, I kind of want to isolate already. This is an easy way to have an excuse to not go eat with people. Perhaps there is a need for a person to fit into a certain community that holds certain dietary beliefs. So a community, I always kind of use the example of CrossFit, and I'm not trying in any way to denigrate CrossFit, but that is a community that holds beliefs about certain exercise habits and certain food habits. And so there might feel like a pressure to do that. Family culture, of course, and caretaker habits can be passed down if you're raised in an environment where, you only have organic foods on hand, or you only have, clean eating schedules from early on in life. It's really hard to break those habits. And then also an extension of spirituality that equates food choices as a reflection of the person. And this comes up more again in like the religious or spiritual sense. But there is a lot of that out there too. And I can't speak to that specifically, but it is coming up in the research a lot that might be a cause as to why people might go into this extreme version of dieting. I thought about some additional questions just to consider for anyone, right? So, how long is it taking you to shop for food? How would you feel eating food someone else made without knowing the specific ingredients? How frequently do you veer off your eating routine, and how might that be impacting your social life? Have there been any food groups that you've eliminated in the last month? How frequently do you avoid eating with others? Are you eliminating categories of food, again, to prevent illness or potential long-term health consequences, either real or feared? Is your focus on food a reaction to loss and or life stressors? Also, what percentage of your day is occupied by thinking about food? So some other considerations as we're exploring the definition of orthorexia. I I wanted to put this all on a continuum, right? If we have intuitive eating on the left, in the middle is more health consciousness, and then all the way to the right is orthorexia. This is kind of how I envision the continuum to be. So for someone who is an intuitive eater, typically they're doing a good job at listening to their body's hunger, fullness cues. We look at intuitive eating as a practice in self-care and actually body respect. This is a complete rejection of diet mentality and diet culture. And the idea is like really making peace with food and therefore finding pleasure in eating, and which you can see would actually really help with like social relationship connection. And also honoring both health and taste buds. So I might get home and really want to have that salad because I haven't had salad all week. That's not me, choosing a healthy option because I'm thinking, oh, I need to be really health conscious. It's, well, I haven't had vegetables today. I really, really would love my taste buds would really love some vegetables. In the middle, in between intuitive eating and orthorexia, I think of this as more of like health consciousness. So this is consistently choosing healthy options, maybe packing lunch instead of choosing fast food, or even just like out in the world options, even like dining hall options. So anything that's prepared by anyone else, essentially. Maybe skipping desserts or reading ingredient labels. I think about that might take to more time at the grocery store. Avoiding trans fats and sugars, making dietary choices like gluten-free or vegan outside of allergies, of course. And this person can typically still socially eat and enjoy exceptions to the rules, quote unquote. So again, there's nothing really wrong with health consciousness, but if we put it on the continuum, the difference between health consciousness and orthorexia is a fine line. With orthorexia, like I've said before, there is really no eating outside of the home. No eating dessert or very minimal eating outside the home unless there's like a very controlled environment the person is going into. Typically fixating on ingredients, long amount of time is spent, and then that emotional turmoil that happens, difficulty forgiving self if you ate outside of what was acceptable. So we really do see a decrease in the quality of life. So I like to think about this as, thinking to yourself, where might I land on this continuum? And if I'm in that more health conscious space, what would be the warning signs for myself if I went into that more orthorexia place? And what would that look like? How would that impact me and my friendships and the quality of my day to day? Some cultural considerations. Of course, we don't just live in a vacuum. So obviously family of origin might really play into this. And I mentioned before, family eating habits can come into play, right? Like what are the food rules your caretakers, your family hold? We also have to really acknowledge that underrepresented populations and socioeconomic status are going to be impacted by this, right? Think about places that have food deserts, food insecurity, folks who actually don't have access to really like good produce. Um, Orthorexia might not actually show up in those populations. There is some privilege in being able to access really good organic, non-GMO food. And so I just wanted to kind of make a comment that some folks might want to be, in this like dieting mentality or strict clean eating, but they might not have access to food that would allow them to. And so would that then mean that there's more restriction and they're not eating enough, and maybe there's more of an eating disorder diagnosis there? So things we just want to be thinking of. There are a lot of cultures where food is a passion or a means for connection, right? Like in the French culture, we think about they really enjoy grocery shopping, they enjoy cooking, they have social meals that last hours, and they talk about food in a way that it feels very connected to the environment. They know typically or are a little bit more aware of where their food is coming from. And so that would again probably change someone's view on food, clean eating, and what food means for them. And we also want to be like acknowledging like if food and eating are painted as a moral dilemma, that might contribute to if someone's going to engage in these sorts of orthorexic thinking behaviors, etc. So I kind of briefly alluded to this before, this idea of people leaving treatment centers and their eating disorder recovery then kind of moving into the space of orthorexia. So there is this kind of known idea in the eating disorder recovery community that quasi recovery can look like someone struggling with orthorexia. So, someone who believes that they have gone through recovery and are much recovered from the original eating disorder might now develop these other more strict tendencies. So, orthorexia really being that like false sense of recovery from an eating disorder. However, right, the rigidity and the cognitive inflexibility remains. We've also seen that orthorexia is more common in folks who are in the process of medically necessary weight restoration. So if they know they have to eat enough to survive and to get their labs back to a place of normality and to feel healthier or to be healthier, then okay, well, I know I have to eat all this food, but I'm going to make sure it's really, 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 really healthy and clean. That's what I'm talking about there. So folks who are really struggling with that, like their body's changing. Well, if I focus on really clean, healthy ingredients, then at least I'm doing something. Again, those warning signs, right? If a person has to stick to their routines and veering off schedule, or even like engaging someone in like exposures, that's from a therapist perspective, doesn't land well for someone. That's something that would be on my radar. And this is very easy to hide in plain sight, which I'll talk about soon. Some barriers to recovery. I really like this graphic on here. It's like an iceberg, and on the top, right, it's like the healthy eating, exercising daily, willpower, discipline. These are the things we look at someone and might in our culture and society and might think, wow, again, you are the beacon of health. You are doing all the things and so proud of you. And I can't tell you how many doctors do this, right? Praise folks for all the healthy eating and exercising that they're doing. However, we need to know what's going on for someone below the surface. Is that person feeling intense guilt or anxiety if they go off that food plan? Is exercising more of a compensation for like eating wrong or eating unhealthy, meaning it's just not joyful exercise at all? Is there that constant self-criticism, body dissatisfaction, social isolation, difficulty taking a rest day, low self-esteem, or even food restriction? So on the surface, things look great. Below the surface, what's happening? The other issue with the idea of recovering from orthorexia is oftentimes people don't really consider this to be a problem. Um, I would say the second to last bullet point goes along with that. So I'll just mention it now that they're egocentric, meaning that it feels good to be orthorexic. There's no push with the ego. The ego isn't saying, don't do this. This is bad for you. This is bad for you. It's like, no, like this is considered to be totally okay. There's a lot of provider bias in the eating, provider bias in the mental health world in general. So unless you're working with a therapist or a dietitian who really applies principles of intuitive eating and like understands eating disorders, understands health at every size, we do see a lot more provider bias in folks who don't kind of take on that mentality. So I've had a lot of clients come to me who had previous doctors tell them that they were doing great, that they were so healthy. Oh my gosh, you're exercising every single day, when that person was actually really, really, really deep in an eating disorder. So that's kind of what I mean by provider bias. Orthorexic tendencies could be rationalized, which means that there's often that resistance to initiating treatment. And then, of course, that leads then to not being able to recognize this as a problem. I'm going to talk about the socio-cultural climate in a moment. And we have to understand like certain underlying issues might not be addressed, which means that the orthorexia can continue. So, for example, if someone's struggling with like a traumatic life experience, and the way that they manage to feel in control in their life is by eating really, really clean and really healthy. Well, again, we might look at that person and think, wow, what willpower and discipline you have, but what are the issues underlying that aren't being addressed, right? The traumas that aren't being processed or the things that aren't being talked about in their life to allow for them to be less needing food, less as a control mechanism. And again, some people really use orthorexia as like a values expression. So it's like I am this person who exercises every day and eats really healthy. Again, there's nothing necessarily wrong with that on the surface, but if we look below the surface and you're experiencing any of these other things underneath the iceberg, then it can be considered more of an illness than a values expression. So again, what I'm not saying is that someone who goes to the gym every day and tries to eat healthy has a problem. What I am saying is we have to explore and know more about what's coming up for that person. For example, when they go off their routine, or how they feel about themselves when they eat something that wasn't part of the plan, things like that. Probably thinking how cute I am. One more thing I will say, I mentioned provider bias towards folks who present like at a medical facility and to their doctor, and they tell their doctor, I'm exercising every day, I'm eating healthy. And the doctor's like, oh, great, you're good to go. But meanwhile, they might be malnourished. The same goes for folks who go to the doctor who are living in larger bodies. And this is something I'm really passionate about, is talking to everyone about how important it is to acknowledge weight stigma. So someone who is extremely, let's say, healthy on paper by labs, by vitals, they have, no concerns really, but yet might be living in a larger body. They might be someone who eats very healthy, who exercises daily, who moves their body, and yet the doctor says, wow, you really need to lose weight. And again, I see this all the time. So that's another side of the provider bias scale. I just want to make sure I mentioned. So the current sociocultural climate, I think, is really important to address when we're thinking about all these issues, because we don't live in a vacuum, we don't live in a bubble, and I'm sure we're all aware of what goes on behind the scenes. But there is such a normalization in our culture to have the ideal quote unquote body type. There's like the term beach bodies that will start cropping up in like during spring break / in the summer. We hear a lot of people talking about like weddings and pregnancies, right? This is like such a big thing now, like how to lose weight before your wedding or how to lose the weight after you have pregnancy, when really we think about these major life experiences like quite stressful for people, and specifically with pregnancy, very tough on the body. And yet there's this sense that like you must bounce back or you must look a certain way. So we could see how that would really contribute to like the orthorexia space. Idealization of healthy eating, again, it's all over the place. This idea that we really shouldn't be putting processed foods into our bodies. What I will say at Renfrew, like with our clients we work with, the idea that we use is all foods fit. So all foods all foods in this world can fit into a healthy eating plan. So it's not just the foods that are free of, trans fats and gluten and this and that. It's everything. You can eat everything. All foods fit into this meal plan. How do we help someone to heal their relationship with food in that way? Thin ideal, I like to mention as a very like white Western image. And it's very unfortunate because our population in America is quite diverse. And so if we think about how many people are trying to fit into this very small, tiny ideal, who will never fit into that thin body ideal. So there's folks in various races, nationalities, ethnicities, whose bodies are completely healthy in different sizes than the thin ideal we have in this particular culture. So it's very dangerous emotionally and mentally for people to try and fit their own body into that. And yet we see this happen all the time, where people feel that it's important to change their bodies to accommodate to whatever they're seeing on represented on TV, or whatever image is being told to them early on in life. And that's kind of the same thing as diet culture. This idea that, again, like there's a certain way of eating that's appropriate, and there's a certain way of living in your body that's appropriate, and anything outside of that is just not okay. I always come across before and after pictures, like even though I feel like most of my own social media is very much in the eating disorder recovery therapist space, I still get fed ads and posts of like, this is what you could look like before you do this weight loss method, and after you do this weight loss method. It feels like there's constantly being fed that social media, of course, Fitspo, right? The Fitspiration movement that's happening. So this idea of like, do this workout, you'll burn fat this way, do this workout plan, you'll do this. And oftentimes you have to pay for them. I also wanted to mention bigorexia, which is also known as muscle dysphoria. And this, sorry, actually it's muscle dysmorphia. No, muscle dysphoria. Yeah. Dysmorphia. I'm getting my words incorrect. But anyway, I think it's muscle dysmorphia now that I think about it. I added that slide, that line last night, so I think I was a little tired. But this is the idea that someone like, especially we see this more in men, who look in the mirror and they think they look really small, but they really want their muscles to be really big and pronounced. And in fact, typically they're just not seeing themselves for what they really look like. So we see a lot of this occurring in like that gym rat mentality, or just like that desire to be really muscular, especially again in the male population. I wanted to make sure I mentioned that because so much of orthorexia and eating disorders tends to be thought of as like a female problem, which is just absolutely not the case. Of course, we now know that it's a cisgender male problem, a cis female problem, trans male, trans female, non binary. I mean, any person of all genders can struggle with an eating disorder. We just so happen to see the bigorexia mentality in the male population. And then there's drunkorexia, which is the idea of saving calories for later. So if I know I'm going to go out drinking tonight, I'm not going to eat as much so that I can save those food calories for when I'm drinking. And of course, what we know about specifically malnourishment and substance use or alcohol use is it's extremely dangerous on someone's medical health. This is where we see like heart issues. This is where we see seizures happening, people passing out. And so just kind of being mindful, like that's really not a good idea. And if you're counting calories and saving calories for later in this particular way, I caution you to be really, really mindful of that. So social media trends, I'm trying to keep up with them. They're constantly changing. I've updated the slide pretty much monthly so that I make sure that I'm keeping up to date with things. You'll see on the right there, I actually took a screenshot of my own Instagram handle, and I had typed in the hashtag clean eating just to see like what would come up. And there was a million things, and this was just the first page. So there's clean eating, which had 47.5 million posts. There's clean eating recipe, clean eating ideas, clean eating lifestyle, clean eating diet, clean eating challenge, clean eating journey, clean eating addict, clean eating for life. And that was just the first page of tags I saw. So we know clean eating and fitness and wellness are out there in the universe, one hashtag away. I think about, well, when I did research on this a couple months ago, the Instagram hashtags, all of the hashtags in the world used on Instagram, the 25th most used was fitness and the 27th most used was food, right? So it's high. Like this is on people's minds. People are searching this on social media and being fed this information. I like to tell my clients to be on the lookout for buzzwords that kind of blend in, but like are actually potentially, if we really examine them, a little bit more diet culture-y. So the idea of being like puffy or bloated. I'm not saying people don't get puffy in the mornings, their skin, or can't feel bloated. But what I've seen in my own practice with folks who are struggling with orthorexia and eating disorders in general is that these terms tend to take on a negative, like judgmental connotation, right? Like, ooh, if I'm bloated, that means I look larger, or it means my body looks distorted. And then what does that mean about what you're telling yourself as a person? And I always like to remind people, right, influencers are making a profit. So typically I'll have my clients show me like, what are you following on social media? And also, are you aware of like where these people are making their income from? Like how many of the things they're posting are ads, for example. So it's not like I'm trying to tell someone, oh, stop following all these people and change your entire worldview, but please be mindful of what it is you're seeing on here and examine it with a little bit of like a cautious lens. So similarly, I typed in hashtag wellness journey into my Instagram, and these are some of the top posts, and I find them to be really interesting. So the one on the left says things to eat after 8 p.m. And there's like all these things that you can eat after 8 p.m. Oh, and you can also download a free ebook. On the right, it was drink this before sleep and wake up with less weight every day. So some sort of juice. We have a few ways to reduce your cancer risk. So kind of speaking to that, like if you're fearful of getting sick for understandable reasons, whether you have been in the past or you've had relatives close to you who've been sick. Um, there's some ways you can reduce your cancer risk, and a lot of them are physical activity, avoiding processed foods, eating cancer fighting foods, which I don't know what cancer fighting foods means. I don't know how this was researched. There's no citations there, but it's one thing you can do. And then another thing was a 4 week challenge and things you shouldn't eat for 4 weeks. And I think what's interesting is like all of these, I mean, of course, these are only four of millions of posts, but all of them have different ideas, right? I go back to this slide, things to eat after 8 p.m., but like actually, no, to the right, you should really just drink this before you go to sleep and you're good. There's nothing that's consistent. There's so many different things you're going to hear and find when you type in this hashtag. And it's overwhelming, but it's also tough for folks who are a little bit more vulnerable, and more likely to read this and think, yeah, like that sounds good. Like I'm gonna do that. I'm gonna try all of these things. What is there to lose? The current diet trends too are really important to name, especially because in the last certainly couple months, the weight loss medication like Ozempic, Wegovy, and now Mounjaro are becoming more accessible to the public. These are, if you're not as familiar, these are diabetes medications that are now being sold as weight loss medications. They're injections that folks give themselves. If you have diabetes, you can get this through insurance. If not, you are paying about $1,300 a month to have these medications. And typically, when people are saying that when they stop them, they gain the weight back. There's also horrendous amount of side effects, but typically what the doctors are saying is that, well, nothing's worse than being in a larger body, right? Nothing's worse than having all this weight on you. So you can kind of handle the side effects, which include significant nausea, muscle degradation, fatigue. I mean, unenjoyment in like daily life pleasures. So the side effects are bad. But this is now the new up and coming thing that we're going to just keep seeing more and more of. And I'm not an expert on this. I'm not a doctor. I have not done any of my own personal research, but from what I'm hearing from the eating disorder community is that there's very little research done on these as effective long term. I think the longest longitudinal study was maybe 5 years. I don't even know if you can call it a longitudinal study. 5 years is not a long time to know what the impact is on these medications. We certainly don't know the impact long term. So just something to be aware of. It's also when I put my eating disorder therapist brain on, I'm thinking about even if you're not someone who thinks you need these or wants to be on them, you see other people around you going on them, and you're going to start to notice bodies changing. And what does that say about our culture and society if all of a sudden we start to see bodies changing in significant ways? How is that going to impact you as a person? So just things that I'm always thinking about. Some other trends there, like carnivore diet, the colon broom, which apparently is a body cleanse. I'm hearing that heroin chic is back. Keto, intermittent fasting is very popular right now, right? Not eating for large chunks of the day. The lemon detox, the paleo diet, cabbage soup cleanses. This is the most bizarre one I heard, which is a full moon parasite cleanse. You can Google that on your own. I'm not going to go into detail, but this is how it's been for the last couple decades, if not 4 or 5 decades. It's just different trends popping up here and there. None have really lasted very long, nor have been proven effective. And yet, again, this is what contributes a lot to some of those orthorexia ways of living and believing. So I will leave you all with some resources that I think are really helpful. And this is coming from me as a therapist who likes to give resources to my clients as well as supports, caretakers, other professionals in the field, resources that I found really helpful and useful in my own work with folks. So these books, I think, are must reads if you are curious about your own relationship with food or your body. So the first two are more focused on food. The second two are more focused a little bit on not only body image, but also the social justice component behind body image. So the first one is by Christy Harrison. She wrote Anti-Diet. She is a dietitian who also has a podcast, which I include on the next slide. And she really talks about how, we're not trying to diet here. We're trying to kind of the notion of all foods fit, and also why it's important to be anti-diet. What happens when we are thinking about food in a different way than like how we would intuitively. She has a lot of great studies and research in there. I love that book. I'm always recommending it to my clients and quoting from it. One of my favorite research topics, I guess topics that she talks about is a study where they gave two different groups of people the same exact smoothie, but they told one group the smoothie was like 100 calories, and they told the other group the smoothie I think was like 800 calories. And the group who was told the smoothie was 800 calories felt fuller and more satisfied. And the group who was told the smoothie was 100 calories felt hungrier and less satisfied after eating. It was the same exact smoothie, but it really went to show the level of or the impact of mental restriction. So mental restriction being this idea, if I think I'm eating X amount of calories, it's going to change my relationship with that item of food. Intuitive eating is this anti-diet approach. I love this book as well. I'm always recommending this book. It's on its like 15th edition or something, or maybe it's just its fourth, but I think it's more than that. And they're constantly updating it to kind of like take into consideration different cultural aspects that are happening, things like that. Sonia Renee Taylor, The Body is Not an Apology, the idea of radical self-love. And she does talk about it as a Black woman in our society, but I think it's so important to read and to think about for yourself. She has all these amazing body image prompts at the end of chapters, so highly recommend. And then Aubrey Gordon wrote You Just Need to Lose Weight and 19 Other Myths About Fat People. She identifies as a fat woman, and she talks a lot about that in her podcast as well, which I also mentioned on the next slide. But I loved this book because it's really, really helpful to understand like how our culture and society has contributed to the way we view folks who are living in larger bodies. The podcasts. I might be a little biased, but I actually really, really love our podcast here at Renfrew called All Bodies, All Foods. There's a lot of really interesting resources in there, and each episode is a different topic. So if you're even just curious to get more information about eating disorders at large and like the research that's happening and different types of treatments, treatment modalities, like I highly recommend listening to that podcast. The Maintenance Phase is my all-time favorite podcast by, again, Aubrey Gordon, who wrote that previous book, and her co-podcaster, Michael Hobbs. It's very funny. They dissect different various trends in our culture and our society. They talk about everything and anything. So it's very, very entertaining, very interesting. It also goes against the ideas that our culture and society places on thin, small bodies. And then Food Psych, Christy Harrison. If you're a little bit more curious about like the dietitian lens and that anti-diet space, I highly recommend Food Psych. I think it is so valuable. And she really demystifies a lot of the myths out there about foods and, diets and allergies. And she's uses science and she uses emotions, and I could not recommend it more. And yeah, if you have any questions for me, I'm happy to respond. I am part-time at Renfrew, so it might just take a couple days to get back to you, but I always like to leave my email address. It's lvogel@renfrewcenter.com. If you're curious about the services at Renfrew, we have a website, renfrewcenter.com, so you can find out more there, but also if you or someone you know could benefit from an intake, the number is on the screen too. It's pretty easy to remember, 1-800-RENFREW. And we have various virtual and in-person options across the country for treatment. So just something to consider to keep in your back pocket when you're thinking about, do I need help? Does someone I know need help? Where can I find help, etc. So thank you all. And yes, Ashley put in the chat the actual link to the podcast. Thank you so much, Ashley, so that you can find it, the Renfrew podcast that we have.
And I'm also more than happy to answer any questions about the Renfrew Center. I know that you may have some
some thoughts kind of brewing right now and may not want to come on screen and ask them, but please feel free to email me. I'm happy to speak with any of you. If you would like additional trainings, that's also an option. So reach out to me. It's Ashley Smith, and I am based out of our Charlotte, North Carolina site, but also handle a lot of the marketing throughout the country. And we do have 19 locations, so we're not just in the Southeast, but we are all across the East Coast, and then in the Midwest and then West, but we also have virtual services as well. And we are able to see you all in Alabama. So you don't even have to leave school to come into our virtual program. So that is an option. If you have any questions, again, feel free to email me and I'd be happy to get back in touch with you.
Thank you both. I want to thank Lacey again for providing her expertise and then also for Ashley representing the Renfrew Center as well. Again, this is a multi-site treatment facility and with many locations from your hometowns, and then as I had mentioned, the exclusive virtual option too. So I do encourage you to explore that if that is something that you are pursuing in your own eating disorder recovery, or are really trying to get some initial intake to see what fits best for you. I did want to announce that I did put in the chat the hyperlink for the Greek Point check-in.